Great, good afternoon. And Dana, thank you so much for being here today. I can say just from my own perspective, it was an exciting opportunity to get to talk at lunch, but when I was tapped to step in for Susanna Loeb, who wasn't able to be here, it was all that much more exciting because I was able to dig out my own personal copy of the Teacher Wars, which I bought hot off the shelf back in 2014 and have been assigning in several of my courses for several years now. And I think is one of those rare pieces that really is able to tackle core central questions about the purpose of education and this workforce, teachers, that we rely on to deliver this essential part of our republic. And doing so in a way that is accessible and intuitive, but pushes us all out of our comfort zone and at the same time builds on a rigorous research base and does what most of us here at the Institute could do a lot better at, is translating that research to a wider audience. So thank you for that. So let's jump right in. Let's get a little bit more on the table here just about you as an individual and kind of your journey and your story. Tell us a little bit more about how you ended up where you are, both here at Brown originally as an undergrad and then into journalism and now at the New York Times.
Sure. Well, I was a journalism nerd from a very young age. I think I started a class newsletter in 3rd grade or something like that. So I attribute it to my parents being lifelong subscribers to the New York Times and having that print paper on the kitchen table every morning and having it be something that we discussed across the table. So even though I don't have any family connections to the field of journalism, it was just a big part of my life. Also, my father was a social studies teacher. He's retired now. And I also want to start by saying that I was part of a desegregation program as a child. As an upper middle class white girl growing up in Westchester County, I was part of a busing program, and I was bused all through elementary school to integrate my town schools. All the children in my town were bused. And it was probably the formative experience of my childhood, and it probably shaped my professional outcome more than anything else. Of course, I had no way of knowing that at the time. So I really was into journalism. I had no idea I would end up doing education journalism. I, was the editor of my high school newspaper, and I came to Brown in part because I thought the BDH was a great paper and I wanted to be involved there. Came to campus. I was a writer and editor at the BDH and a history concentrator. Graduated. Did not get the full-time job in journalism that I wanted. My first job was at the Center for American Progress, which is a think tank in Washington. I was very frustrated because I wanted to be reporting, not working at a think tank. And I said to myself, I'm going to apply for a few more journalism jobs, and if I don't get one, I will go to graduate school for history and enroll in a PhD program if I'm lucky enough to get accepted. And right then at that moment, I got a job in journalism. So this book is my alternate path and represents something I would have liked to have done, maybe with my whole career if I hadn't gone into journalism. But I'm really glad I'm a reporter. I think the pace of it suits me. I do lots of different types of stories. I do stories I spend 48 hours on. I do stories I spend 5 weeks on, and I do stories I spend 6 or even 9 months on. And usually I have all those going all at once. So it's exciting. It's very varied. I never thought that I would be doing education journalism as a focus all this time. That's probably been the biggest surprise of my career. 15 years ago, it was much more common to be a general interest journalist. The way the profession is changing, expertise is really valued. And I noticed that changing when I was early in my career after having graduated Brown. And I saw, young reporters around me having a lot of success by saying, I'm going to focus on foreign policy or healthcare or electoral politics. And that was kind of when I dug deep to what do I really care about and what can I bring to the table. And I realized that my interest in education stemming from this, partially from growing up in a house where education was discussed, partially from, being a student who participated in a busing desegregation program and having a lot of thoughts and experiences I wanted to process around that, to be perfectly frank. For me, it was an extremely positive experience. I think it was less positive for some others who are less privileged than me. So all that went into sort of slowly over time it becoming more and more of a focus for me. And now still doing it in 2020, which is a surprise to myself.
And we benefit from that. I wanted to turn first in our conversation to your book, which focuses on the teaching profession, but I'm glad you brought up this kind of personal experience about busing and desegregation, because that's a topic that you've covered in several of your articles, and I want to return to that as well. So one of the things that we've been grappling with as a nation is this question about who should teach, who should be the almost 4 million citizens that are tasked with the immense responsibility of educating our nation's youth. And you do a deep dive both in the history of the profession and kind of take us up to the present and where we are today, which is really this difficult conversation we've had around what does it mean for teachers to be high quality? What does it mean to have a profession that we treat as one of high status or not? What did you learn in your work on this book that you think could inform where we are today in this national dialogue around who teaches and how we can improve the teacher workforce?
I'm glad you mentioned the number 4 million, because one of the most important things to know about teaching is the vast number of teachers we need for the system to function. And the number's not going to change hugely, at least in the foreseeable future. So I think because of that, it has to be a job where we have the capacity to take a really diverse and broad variety of individuals into it and help them excel and do well within it. Sometimes people say, well, how come teaching is not like law or medicine? Well, there's fewer than 1 million lawyers in the U.S. It's something like 600 or 700,000 people. So that just gives you a sense of the scale that we're talking about. We don't have any shortage of intellectual, elite, academically able teachers in this country. There are, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them. But we do need to be able to take young and experienced people into the profession, help them get better over time, provide incentives, financial or otherwise, for them to stay in the classroom or to pursue, whatever other career they would like in education to make the system better. All that is really important. And I think the profession needs to be one that allows sufficient creativity and autonomy for people to want to do it. I mean, I think I always use this anecdote, which is in my book, which is, when I first graduated from Brown, I think I got something like $27,000 in my first job. And a teacher in New York City public schools, of which I had friends who were doing that job at the time, were making, over $45,000 a year. So I thought, wow, amazing for them. They're doing a lot better than me. Well, look now, 15 years later, I'm in my mid-30s. The situation is like completely reversed. I've been able to climb and have regular advancement, increasing autonomy, increasing recognition. And a teacher who's just as great, if not better than me at what they do, they're often not experiencing that ladder. And I still do think that is a really big problem with the way the profession is structured in the United States.
That's really interesting and rings true with my own personal experience, having gone directly into the public school teaching out of undergrad a few years before you graduated and earning a salary of $38,000 without any prospects of career advancement in the formal sense that a lot of my peers were taking advantage of in the first couple of years. So we've seen recently that teachers have mobilized in ways to raise these issues that you put on the table, declining real wages, a lack of say in a lot of the school decisions, advocating for higher investment in education more broadly. What did studying the history and evolution of teacher unions teach us about the role unions have to play in securing a high-quality education for all American children and the potential challenge they present in achieving that goal?
That's a big one. Yes, I spent years thinking about this. I think teachers' unions have the potential to be highly progressive and powerful organizations, but it doesn't always turn out that way in practice. I covered the Red for Ed movement, the sort of wave of teacher walkouts and strikes that started in early 2018 and in some ways is still going on now. It started in right-to-work conservative states that did not have empowered organized labor. Why did it start there? Those teachers were the most frustrated. They were the most underpaid, and that's partly because they didn't have representation. But at the same time, the national unions were in some sense caught a bit flat-footed by that movement. In West Virginia, at a certain point, the union leaders were saying, okay, we've got enough here. We can end this strike. And it was really the grassroots teachers that were saying, we're going to push for more, and they did eventually get a little bit more. Not all that much more, but they did get a little bit more. It's been interesting watching this Democratic primary. The unions have chosen not to really pick a favorite. I think they're in a position of relative strength within the Democratic Party right now compared to the Obama years. During the Obama years, they were really back on their heels, confronted with a bunch of policies supported by the incredibly popular Democratic president, which they opposed, such as expansion of the charter school sector and evaluating teachers with student test scores. All of those things were things they were very much against, and they were not the voice that they had been if, say, Hillary Clinton had won that 2008 election. Now, I think because the Red for Ed movement was so exciting, it was so exciting for mainstream Democrats and those on the left more broadly to see in these red conservative states in the Trump era, a mass demonstration of millions of people going out on the streets to talk about issues like wages, per pupil funding of schools, school buildings that were falling apart, textbooks that were 20 years old. It was very inspiring to many people. That was such a show of force, and it's the kind of energy in places like Arizona, which is a true swing state and one of the walkout states, that any Democratic candidate is going to be super eager to harness in November. So the unions are empowered right now. I still think there's, big issues that they could have a stronger voice on or a louder voice. Equity issues, bringing diversity to the profession. They're active on all these for sure. But I think, I just consistently hear from, grassroots parents and students and teachers that they want to be even more active on those things, beyond just wages. Wages are so important right now for teachers. I can't emphasize that enough because in many of the places that need teachers, it is really hard to find housing that teachers can afford. Like, we just have a affordable housing crisis in this country. As much as I love to go to the Bay Area because it is so beautiful, one of the more depressing stories I've done a lot of my stories are depressing, so let me rephrase that. One of the many depressing stories that I've done in the last couple years entailed being in the San Jose metro area in Silicon Valley and just talking to these teachers who are in my generation, so like older millennials, but in their 30s, approaching 40, have kids, have responsibilities, have aging parents, some of us, and they can't be homeowners, but they also can't be renters because the prices are just so crazy. And, the bottom line is a community doesn't function without teachers. And if you're making $60,000 a year in those locations, you're actually working class. You're not middle class. So I think teachers are like a vanguard of, what's going on in this economy with the rise of inequality right now. Teachers were sold a vision of their life, which was they would be solidly middle class, they'd be the type of people who could afford a home, go on vacation occasionally, get a pension and retire and be comfortable. That's not the deal that teachers of the millennial generation and younger are getting. People of our generation are not getting that deal in this profession of teaching. So they're angry.
I was actually a public school teacher in the Bay Area, and that couldn't ring more true. The writing was just on the wall, that it was just not feasible to do anything other than stuff a whole bunch of young kids in an apartment for a short period of time.
Yes.
So, given the compelling reasons why we should care about the teacher workforce, the importance of tackling inequity around educational opportunity, we hear about these things in some of the early Democratic primaries, but I'd say that issue has faded a bit as the election has advanced. Why isn't it more front and center?
I don't really think it often emerges as a general election issue because there's nothing to argue against, because the Republican Party, it's been a while since they put forth a really big vision on education, since George W. Bush ran and was president. So there's just sort of fatigue on education policy at the national level right now, because what was tried with No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top under President Obama is seen as quite disappointing in results. And that may be a really big oversimplification, and I'll acknowledge that. But a lot of the sort of high, almost ecstatic hopes that people had for those reform strategies turned out to be overblown. And so I think in both parties now there's a little bit of a sense of humility about the role of the federal government improving local schools. And, you know, when it comes to teaching specifically, it truly is a state and local issue in terms of funding. So the federal government's limited. I mean, I think, you know, Kamala Harris had a plan that she launched her presidential candidacy with to pay teachers more with an incentive program of federal money that would be structured maybe a little bit like Race to the Top, where if states did the thing that the federal government wanted them to do, in this case, pay teachers more, there'd be, you know, a federal stream of money to go along with it. And in an environment where a Democratic president is elected and Democrats get the majorities in Congress that they would need, I could see that being a bill, for sure. But there's a lot of ifs in that sentence.
Right. So, last question about your book, and then I'm excited to turn to your more recent work with the Times. What do you think are some of the big insights or takeaways that are relevant both for the teaching profession, but more broadly around how we think about education in this country?
From my book?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess I should think about what I learned writing the book.
That'd be great.
Maybe what I learned since the book was published. Would that be interesting? Because it came out in 2014. It's 2020. So when I started writing the book, there truly was a teacher war going on. Teaching was super controversial at that time. I don't know if we can all jog our memories, but there were segments on television specials and on the front covers of magazines, which people still used to read back then, which were like, bad teachers, what do we do about these bad apples? Yeah. And, you know, Michelle Rhee would be holding a broom on the cover of Time magazine, with the implication being that she was going to sweep these nasty bad teachers just out the door. We're going to get rid of these people. Just the sense of like the tenured, vampiric, suck on tax dollars. Just, these were bad guys. It was, you know, as the daughter of a public school teacher who saw the sacrifices my dad made to work in public education, it was tough. Yeah. One of the reasons I wanted to cover this is because I just didn't feel good about what I was hearing at that time. And especially, you know, knowing so many friends from Brown who were coming out of a school like this who could have done a lot of different things and were choosing to teach. There were just so many levels of it that bothered me. So I guess what I'll say has improved a lot is we're not in that moment anymore. I think teachers are much more celebrated now in 2020 than they were 6 years ago. I think there's much more bipartisan consensus around what a hard job it is. this thing of no excuses, the idea that we can't talk about how our Black and brown students are criminalized by the justice system and how that might impact their ability to function at school. We can't talk about family poverty and how it's hard to focus at school if you haven't had breakfast in the morning, or your family is in housing insecurity, or your parents work 3 jobs so they don't have time to read to you in early childhood. It used to be, like 10 years ago, that if you brought any of that up, you were, quote, making excuses, and were not considered really a serious participant in the education policy discussion. That's kind of,
Right.
I'm curious if you agree, but I feel that has diminished greatly.
Yeah, I think there are still pockets where that mantra exists, but the national dialogue, I mean, we see evidence in public opinion polls about kind of general positive feelings towards teachers have risen immensely in the wake of a lot of the Red for Ed strikes.
Yes.
And there's no doubt that the kind of hyperbolic conversations we've had about the rubber room teachers coming from New York City, where you are working, those folks who are being paid basically not to work are not the headlines that we're seeing today.
And I want to credit the Black Lives Matter movement heavily with some of these shifts, because this is something that I noticed, which was, after Michael Brown was killed, and there was some great work, like by my colleague Nicole Hannah-Jones, about what Michael Brown's life was like before he died and how he had been failing schools, and his mom, after he died, said, "Do you know how hard I worked to try to get this kid through high school?" For that to be what you're thinking about, as Nicole pointed out, when your son has just been killed, is stunning. It suggests that the fight for educational equity, was so top of mind for this family that was in a segregated district, in a segregated community that was subjected to extraordinary scrutiny by the criminal justice system, decades of issues in that town of Ferguson. It just became more and more difficult for people who broadly consider themselves from the center of the policy debate to the left. But I'm talking about the center in particular. There just was a consciousness raising that happened that it is absurd to come to the table in an education conversation without a broader lens into children's lives. And I think that's been positive.
So let's continue on this kind of broader intersection of education in our society. One of the clearest manifestations of the challenges that we are living in our society that plays out in schools is the segregation and progressively resegregation of our public schools. And you've done work on this, particularly looking at the school choice system in San Francisco and what's going on in Howard County, Maryland. What have you learned by talking to people on the ground and kind of really training your lens on these specific cases?
That's a great question. There's bright spots in the school segregation story, and there's also a lot of reason to feel dejected about the school segregation story. So San Francisco, the choice system that allows you to go to schools outside of your neighborhood in San Francisco has created a school system that is more segregated than the neighborhoods of San Francisco. And recent research has actually shown that there's a whole cluster of American cities where this is the case. So basically what happens is you take a city that's undergoing rapid demographic change and gentrification like San Francisco, and you allow people to not go to schools that are near their homes, and there becomes a kind of rush among upper middle class families. They're not in the most expensive areas of San Francisco. They're in changing areas, but they're not going to their neighborhood school. They want to all go to the cluster of schools that are in the, step more gentrified zone. And they've created an extremely complex system, which requires parents to take time off work, to tour many different schools, and then fill out this form. And then there's a lottery, which would work very well in randomizing school choice if all parents had access to the same information. But that is an ideal that is not reality. So they've created a system that is supposed to lead to equity, but is in fact more deeply segregating. That is quite an example to me of how the ethos of choice can lead to unexpected outcomes. They are currently, I think, heavily considering overhauling it, and I may not be fully up to date on what they've done, but I believe this year they are essentially overhauling the system. It just has not worked as intended. So that was not a great story. I mean, it was an interesting story to do. Some of the real estate listings out in San Francisco will advertise to luxury renters and buyers that because it's a historically low-income neighborhood, you get a preference in the lottery. So the lottery weighs residents in a zip code that has historically had low test scores. And that was the way they sort of were hoping to give a leg up to low-income kids. But the city housing situation is changing so rapidly that there's now $1 million plus homes in these areas. So as a parent shopping at the $1 million plus level, you can seek out a zone which will give you an advantage meant for a low-income family. The crazy thing is when you talk to those parents, they're like, well, I'm not going to benefit from the Uber IPO. They feel, I mean, this is America in 2020. Those parents feel between a rock and a hard place, some of them. I don't feel particularly sorry for them, but that is what you get when you talk to them. And as, you know, as a professional, college-educated parent that's going through the question of where I'm going to live and send my daughter to school currently right now, you know, I think many parents face difficult choices between all of these factors. But the system should not be built for people like me. I feel pretty certain of that. So they have some work to do in San Francisco. Now, Howard County, Maryland was really interesting as the suburbs of Baltimore. They had a superintendent, a white progressive superintendent who wanted to do something about school segregation. Howard County was founded to be an ideally integrated community. If you know anything about that community, it centers on a town called Columbia, Maryland. It's a planned community that was planned during the time of redlining to be an inclusive community. So the anecdote I tell in my piece is the very first baby born in the late 60s in this planned community was biracial with one black and one white parent. And this is like the point of pride decades later. They still talk about this, right? That's the type of ethos that they profess in this town. Yet, in 2019, when the superintendent decides that he wants to change some busing patterns and zoning in the district to integrate the schools, all hell breaks loose. And I went down there to, you know, see what was going on, and what I basically saw was a lot of white and Asian college-educated parents actually, picketing with signs outside the Board of Education against this plan. They don't want their children bused further from home. They have a lot of concerns about the commute time. And they also were making an argument that this would be bad for low-income kids. So it was, you know, they were trying to frame it
Right.
in a certain way. And that has a lot of historical resonances with things that have happened in the past. The plan was tweaked, modified, and weakened, but did eventually pass. And it will lead to some further integration in that county, though not as much as they had hoped for. So I would say it was sort of a mixed victory for advocates of integration. So there's, you know, bright spots and dark spots on this issue.
So related to thinking about the parents' role in either advocating for or in some cases obstructing or just by choice of neighborhood location complicating the challenges of segregation is thinking about how schools prepare people to grapple with these challenges as citizens and eventual parents. And your piece on the role of textbooks and social studies education highlighted some of the ways in which our curricula and our texts in public schools really mirror some of the social dilemmas and debates about how should we think about these questions. What did you take away from this deep dive into the way the textbook industry works in our public education system?
So my investigation looked at social studies textbooks on American history from Texas and California and compared them. I think take a topic like redlining. It's not mentioned at all in the Texas state social studies standards, and it is highlighted in California. I mean, that's really meaningful, I think. It's how do we actually access a current conversation about school and housing, integration and segregation without knowing our history? Now, kids don't sit there memorizing what's in the textbooks. Teachers don't tend to hew to them very closely. But these textbooks, which are so politically influenced, which is what my investigation showed, they do reflect the state standards that the states give to teachers, which are what teachers look at when they make their lesson plans. And for those states that do testing in American history, which is most of them, the questions that are going to be on the test, which is absolutely what the kids are learning. So it's very powerful to me that a major state like Texas, where suburbanization shaped the landscape so heavily, is not, the words housing discrimination don't appear in the social studies standards. So there's big change happening in this area. I mean, LGBTQ history is one that's changing extremely rapidly right now. There's, I think, 4 states, New York, Illinois, California, Massachusetts, that have either said they want to include LGBTQ history in the standards or are moving toward that currently. That's something that would have been unthinkable, like when we were in high school. We're not that old. So I think that change is possible. But you do still see race as a huge dividing line in this country on how history is taught. And I just can't really think of anything that's more important to talk about in 2020, given where our politics are.
So you have covered a wide range of topics. Just looking up your profile in New York Times, you get to see all your recent topics, and they range from, the current coronavirus implications for schooling to thinking about school shootings and other kind of very of the moment issues to these deep dives. Has there ever been a topic that you've been excited about, passionate about, but your editors have just said no thanks to?
No. If I'm really excited about it, I can get them excited about it.
Wow.
But sometimes it takes some convincing. So my story on debates about how reading is taught, that's actually a really common conversation in education circles, but it was a new one for my editors. And they were like, ooh, like cognitive science, the brain, like phonics. I think on first glance it seemed a little dull to them. And I was like, trust me, people are going to read this article. And then they did in the end. They pushed me really hard to make the article more accessible, easier to read, easier to get through, shorter. They always want my pieces to be shorter than I want them to be, 100% of the time. So those conversations can be hard, and we have a back and forth, me and my editors, who are great, love them. But yeah, I think I love working at the Times because they're just the best editors in the business. My colleagues are amazing, and if I come in fired up about something and I say, like, listen, you got to trust me on this, they do give me the benefit of the doubt.
And what is it like being a journalist in the age of fake news and social media? How does that influence how you think about your job and your work?
Well, I'll tell the story that I told at lunch.
Sure.
So about a year ago, I did a story about how conservative legislators and some other folks in Michigan wanted to take the word democracy out of the state's social studies curriculum. So they no longer wanted to describe the United States as a democracy, but only as a republic. Let's put aside for now what the arguments were on that. Some of the folks that were involved with that, when I went to their social media, their Facebook, their Twitter, it was filled with sort of Trumpian anti-media rhetoric, like the lying New York Times, the failing New York Times, and the mainstream media is so biased, and it's the liberal media and all this. And I had to call this one guy because he was the ringleader of this movement to remove the word democracy. So I actually I don't usually feel super nervous before doing an interview, but I was really nervous just because he had a lot of nasty stuff about the Times specifically. So I thought, oh, he's not going to like getting this call. Well, he was so excited to get the call. He could not wait to be interviewed by a New York Times reporter. We talked for over an hour. He was super nice to me on the phone. I said, oh, you're probably going to say no, but can a photographer come into your house, take a portrait of you? Oh, yes, absolutely. Tomorrow, does tomorrow work? So think about that for a second. If you really believed that the Times was filled with lies and biased against people who had your viewpoint, would you be very eager to spend an hour on the phone with a Times reporter and have a photographer come take your picture tomorrow? I just have to conclude that among some of the folks with college and master's degrees who are elected politicians who spout this rhetoric, that a certain amount of it is entirely cynical. I do think they truly do resent that they perceive that, you know, the folks that work in media are broadly cosmopolitan people who live in major cities and have a broadly liberal worldview. I'm using liberal in like a small L sense of the word, if that makes sense. I know that's not a thing, but you know what I'm saying. It's not like waving the flag for Bernie or something. It's more just like their strength and diversity, you know.
Yes.
That type of platitude. Yeah, I do think there's, you know, maybe some legitimate resentment. Could we do a better job in the media of covering the middle of the country? Sure. You know, we talk about it on the national desk of the New York Times all the time. We actually have reporters that live everywhere in this country. You know, I'm a minority of national reporters for the Times that live in New York City. So we've got people in Kansas, we've got people in Arizona and Texas, all over the place.
Missouri, where I'm from as well.
I'm not sure we have someone in Missouri right now. Actually, I think we do. We
All
do
right.
have one person in Missouri. Yes. Yes.
So let me also wrap up to move to the questions that the audience members may have by asking you more about your experience taking advantage of you being at your alma mater. What about your time here at Brown do you think really sticks with you today that you look back to as something that was formative, that may have kind of shaped your interest, your passions, your career trajectory? What advice
man.
would you give to the students in the room?
Everything. You're just so lucky to be here. Just, gosh, I see Professor Spare. I was about to mention your class. That's really eerie. I only took one education class, which was with Professor Spare on the history of American education reform. So you never know which class you take is going to end up being really influential on your life. Like, I knew education was an interest of mine, but I wouldn't have known that it was going to end up being a professional course. So I think take advantage of the new curriculum and the openness of Brown to explore really widely is one piece of advice. And I'm just still like really good friends with so many people from Brown. And I still meet Brown alumni who I didn't know on campus, who are very often just the most curious, creative people that are doing the most interesting work. And I think certainly among like the Ivy League schools, Brown grads tend to forge their own paths in the world, which is something that I really appreciate about having been here on campus and just the variety of different passions that people pursue. The Brown Daily Herald is a great daily campus newspaper, and it was absolutely formative. The many late nights I spent there paid off in terms of just really learning what it was like to be a journalist, and just the whole history department was just wonderful. I think concentrating in history was an awesome choice going into journalism. It gets you thinking about how to sort of take in a large amount of material from a diverse group of perspectives and be able to analyze it and write well about it, and I just really appreciate that the history concentration here was heavily focused on writing and becoming a better writer and writing very often and writing a lot. That was really wonderful preparation for me professionally.
I think our faculty in the history department might invite you back as a spokesperson. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dana. Let me take the opportunity to open up the floor to our audience to find out what questions or topics you'd love to engage with.
Can you talk a little more about how reading is taught? You wrote an article or a book or a series on that?
Yeah, I had an article about 3 weeks ago. Time is compressing in my mind. So I think there's a revival of a debate that's been going on right now since the 19th century. It's a very old debate, which is how heavily should phonics be emphasized when we teach young children how to read, so say from age 4 to 8 or so. Phonics, very simply, this is a huge oversimplification, so I apologize if any of you are reading experts, but phonics is sounding it out. Fun, f-n is the word fun, okay? Many teachers subscribe to an idea that you don't need to emphasize it that heavily, that it can be sort of part of things, but you don't really need to do a lot of drills or kind of sequenced practice on those sound letter combinations. That idea is pretty dominant in schools of education and is sometimes talked about as balanced literacy. Among, say, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists who look at MRIs of people's brains while they read, there's a very different belief. They have seen that the parts of the brain that are intimately involved with reading, even in we adults who read very well, are the same parts of the brain that are hearing parts of the brain. So this has led them to conclude that it's extremely important, in fact, especially for those kids maybe that don't have a ton of books at home and don't just have a lot of listening to reading going on in their day-to-day lives, that schools ought to be focused on phonics more heavily. I think the reason why this is surfacing right now is the most recent test scores that have come out in reading for the United States are very poor, declining. So between 2017 and 2019, almost all states and all cities had declining reading scores. The gap between good readers and bad readers grew. We're supposed to be closing achievement gaps in the United States, not widening achievement gaps. That's very concerning. So people are debating how to teach kids to read. And there's a broad feeling right now, among experts at least, that classroom practices have not caught up to some pretty well-established science.
Yes, please. And if you could speak into the microphone.
Sure. So during the time that you've been covering education, you've seen the continued evolution and maturation of Teach for America. And I'm curious what the perspectives have been on TFA during the time that you've been covering it.
That's a good question. I've written a lot about them, but not in the last couple of years. They're a big part of my book. I don't think it's credible anymore to argue that what TFA provides in the form of 5 weeks training over the summer is adequate. And in fact, sending people with just 5 weeks of training into the highest need schools is a sad commentary on how much we prioritize that type of work. However, I think TFA has changed a lot. I think that they no longer argue that 5 weeks of training is adequate. They are focused more on going where the need is greatest and not just the cities that young graduates of Brown and other schools want to live in. They have encouraged people to go to places that are truly hard to find teachers to work in, like rural West Virginia and the Mississippi Delta, stuff like that. They have experimented with some ways over the years of maybe getting people in junior year of college so they can have contact with them for a longer period of time and provide them with more training. They have shifted their rhetoric and I think have grown as an organization. They are also sending a lot of their recruits into charter schools that are aligned with the TFA mission, where the teachers get a lot of support and are kind of enmeshed in an atmosphere where they've become quite practiced at using quite inexperienced young teachers. I think you always need to balance any critiques of TFA with the acknowledgement that traditional teacher training also doesn't necessarily work that well. So whether you have 5 weeks of training that doesn't adequately prepare you or 24 months of training that doesn't adequately prepare you, there is a problem with not being adequately prepared. There's work being done around stuff like residencies where you're, instead of a lot of coursework that's not necessarily relevant to teaching, you may spend a year as an apprentice in a real classroom and get, more of a real world view of what it takes to be a great teacher. I just want to acknowledge that every single person who did TFA ever took on an incredible challenge with gusto and passion that I personally have never done and did not volunteer to do, which is to go into a community that's of high need and really commit yourself to that for 2 years. And that is extremely commendable. They have created a true, now multi-generations of passionately committed folks that care deeply about educational equity. And the folks that come out of TFA run the entire spectrum ideologically on education. You have the head of the Los Angeles Teachers Union, who's a Brown graduate. He was in the very first class of Teach for America in 1989. He was leading that strike they had in LA, that very disruptive strike that they had last year. You've got him. He's very anti-charter school. He's very anti-standardized testing. And you've got the leaders of the major charter school networks like KIPP, who are also alumni of TFA. So they have brought together young people who are passionate about this, and they have gone out in the world and they have been independent, each individual in the path that they have chosen. So it's had an enormous impact in many, many different ways.
Just briefly, someone who, as you heard, focuses a lot on causal inference and thinking about TFA, one of the most difficult things that you highlight, Dana, is that we often want to say TFA versus a traditionally trained, fully certified licensed teacher. But the counterfactual in a lot of these environments is not that. They're not locations or schools that are having success at recruiting that type of teacher. And we know in the most recent nationally representative survey that between 7 and 9% of schools were unable to fill a teaching vacancy at all. And so the challenge here is dealing with this macro environment that we've talked about. It's just one more piece of data to think about
It's
that.
very important.
Maybe following in on that, the funding of schools, do you have, it doesn't seem to be working particularly well. Do you have any theories or thoughts about how that might be improved? Or
That's a big one. So I think the role of states in funding is generally underappreciated. One of my big takeaways from covering the teacher strikes and the teacher walkouts was like in Oklahoma, whether you're living in a shishi suburb or in a poor urban neighborhood, your school funding is terrible compared to like in Massachusetts or New York because they have pursued austerity as a state. So a lot of the funding inequities right now are state to state. Now, there's different ways of funding within states that also produce inequities that we're all aware of. whether it's through property taxes, through state formulas that don't do enough to balance those property taxes, or through stuff like PTA donations. There's public schools in my neighborhood in Brooklyn that raise close to $2 million per year in PTA donations. So at that point, you almost have to ask, is this a public school? Think about that. I don't know.
Let's get some student voices in the room, if that's possible. Anyone? Yeah, in the back.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm actually currently a writer for the BDH, so I'm really glad you had a great experience there. I was just wondering, like, did you think it was representative of like a professional working environment at the BDH, and also
Yes.
I've
Especially the constant presence of pizza. That's totally how the New York Times actually is. Continue.
And also I've noticed, especially in interviewing sources that might be, a little resistant to talking to a reporter, how important it is to ask not just good questions, but the right questions. So I'm just wondering, like, how is your experience in, learning how to ask those questions?
Well, that's a great question. So I think you're doing really great. So sometimes before an interview, I feel nervous about a specific question, and that's a really good sign to ask that question. My nervousness about asking it usually exceeds the person's ability to handle it, because if they're immersed in some topic or issue or debate in their community that's controversial or difficult, they may have already encountered that question a lot of times, even though it's the first time that you have to articulate it. And sometimes I'm like, oh gosh, I'm like this white lady and I'm coming into this, conversation about race. Can I ask this difficult question? And I do have to ask the difficult question. I do. And I just try not to center myself in asking the question. And I try to think about how the other person will hear it. But I try to ask open-ended questions in the beginning of the interview and then get to the more pointed, more difficult questions as it goes on. And then end with a softball that's going to be easier for them, if that makes sense. I just kind of think about the structure of it. I don't plan out a script for asking my questions to sources. I do know there's 3 or 4 big questions that I want to get to, and I find that if I write them down in advance, I usually don't even have to look back at them, because they're in the act of writing them down has kind of put them into my mind, and then I can focus on just talking to the person to person. But a good standard for me is that I should be hearing their voice a lot more than my own in the conversation. And then if I need to come in with that pointed, difficult question, then I'm just doing it sensitively and at the right time. I would rarely start with the most difficult question unless I'm 5 minutes with Chuck Schumer, which has happened, You have 5 minutes with Chuck Schumer. He's going to call you right now, and you have 5 minutes. So I'm definitely going to ask him the hardest question first. He can handle it. You have to think about who you're talking to. A parent who's enmeshed in a school segregation battle in their local neighborhood is really different than the Senate Minority Leader. You just approach those really, really differently.
Thank you. I'm actually a parent of Providence public school students, and we have a district that's been recently, feels like it was a long time ago, but only a few months ago, taken over by the state.
Yes.
And I've been super involved, and I'm on a community design team that's trying to make recommendations about things the school district could do differently. And this is a big question, but I'm curious, having visited lots of school districts, seen a ton over the course of your writing career, as you think about an urban school district trying to turn around all sorts of stuff, what are some of the levers? Yeah. I'm not looking for the answer, but I'm curious what levers you've seen that seem to make a difference.
I think principals are incredibly important. Sometimes, as a parent getting ready to go into New York City public schools, and with a lot of other parents in my demographic that like to, ask me questions when they hear what I do for a living, they'll often say oh, I live on a street that has 2 blocks down on one side is one school, and everyone wants to go to that one. And 2 blocks down on the other side, everyone's avoiding that school. can you explain that to me? And I'm almost always say, it's the principal. I'm almost positive, even without looking into the specific situation. So that's one really important thing. You have to have a dynamic principal that is a good leader and can lead adults and kids, work with parents, and have a vision for instruction that will be inspiring to teachers. I just really can't emphasize that enough, that the reforms need to get into the classroom. I think, we were all horrified by that Johns Hopkins report that said instruction was not happening in many Providence classrooms. So that is a really good reminder of what needs to take place. California just came down with a settlement in a so-called right to read case in which some plaintiffs were arguing that the state of California has basically allowed children to be illiterate. So what they've come up with is a big funding stream that's going to go to bottom performing schools in California, but they haven't really set too many standards on what the money's going to be spent on. Something like that makes me go, just from the experience of covering education. I mean, if you're going to hire literacy coaches, if the trade-offs are literacy coaches versus class size reforms, I mean, that's tough. You have to bring some stakeholders to the table. I have a personal opinion about some ways that I might spend that money, but I'm not going to say what that is. But people are going to disagree virulently on whether you should have smaller class size or hire more literacy coaches. And then if you do hire literacy coaches, what kind of coaching are they going to do? Are they going to do phonics, structured phonics? Or are they going to be doing something else? Like bringing more classroom libraries in and focusing on getting more books in. Well, we might all agree that all of that needs to happen. But in an environment of scarce resources, really hard choices need to be made. So I think you have to start by realizing hard choices need to be made and prioritizing them and getting the right people into leadership. Great principals are almost always have been great teachers. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. I think there's been a lot of efforts to bring people in from outside education and see if they can be great principals and all this, and I'm skeptical.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. I know that there may be parameters here around what you are able or willing to say, but I'm wondering if you're just willing to muse for a few minutes around the presidential candidates' education plans and where you see strengths and gaps, and maybe if the things that if you're surprised various things are getting certain amounts of attention or that things are not.
Yeah, I guess I'll put Trump aside for a minute because I don't think he has an education platform. I mean, I think we all know what Betsy DeVos believes about. We're all on the same page. We know what Betsy DeVos believes about schools, right? Her overriding life passion is to use public dollars to help people attend private school. It's her overriding passion. She has a few other things that she has worked on, like sexual harassment issues in schools, but that's really why she wakes up in the morning. And Trump is an empty vessel on this issue. He doesn't really have priors, really. So that said, the federal government can't really do anything to like have this national vast voucher program that Betsy DeVos wants. So let's just put that aside. The Democrats. There was not a lot of space between them. The space between them emerged basically on one issue, which was charter schools. They all came out and said they wanted to pay teachers a lot more. They all came out and said they wanted to further reduce the role of standardized testing in schools. This all came from the strength of the teacher walkouts and the teacher protest movement. Charter schools are still a divisive issue in the Democratic Party, and it's a really complicated issue because Black and Hispanic parents are the most supportive of charters, and liberal college-educated whites are the least supportive in some respects. Now, all of the communities are divided. It's kind of one of these 50-50 issues. Although there's marginally more support among parents of color, there's still lots of parents of color that are skeptical of them as well. So it's going to continue to be a divisive issue in the Democratic Party. The folks I talk to in the charter school movement are really, really scared right now. They're used to their issue being a consensus issue, that Democrats and Republicans can all get behind charter schools. They had support from George W. Bush, from Bill Clinton, from Hillary Clinton, from Barack Obama. They're in a new reality. Trump's latest budget proposal cuts federal funding for charter schools. And Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren want to totally cut federal funding for new charter schools. Biden very pointedly did not mention them in his white paper on education. He doesn't use the phrase because he doesn't want to be asked about it or talk about it. Pete Buttigieg was kind of softly critical, saying they need more accountability. He had sort of shown a little bit more openness to charters, but he dropped out yesterday. Was that yesterday? Yes, that was yesterday. I've lived a million lives since then. So there's not a lot of space between these Democrats. There's not a lot of space between them. I mean, Bloomberg is the one who's really out on his own. I mean, Bloomberg is a very strong supporter of charter schools. He's a very strong supporter of accountability for teachers, and paying teachers and judging teachers using student test scores was an overriding interest of his when he was mayor of New York City. He did small schools, which were successful. The movement to break up big comprehensive high schools into smaller academies showed good results. The long-term results were positive, so he deserves credit for that. Overall, I'd say his record as mayor on schools was kind of mixed.
Hi, Dana.
Hi.
Thank you for your reporting.
I'm so happy to be here.
If you had 6 months to write one story, either a story that you feel like is being told or not being told today, what would you focus on? And I realize maybe you don't want to give it away, but
I don't have like a really specific answer for that right now, but I do have sort of an umbrella area that I think it would be interesting to spend that amount of time on, which is the idea of what is a good school. I just think there's a lot of misconceptions about what makes a school good, and I think kind of getting into what people think is good versus what may actually be good would be a real public service. That's not going to be something I'm able to do in 2020, but I hope maybe I can get into some of those questions more in 2021. This year, because it's a presidential election year, there's going to be more focus on covering the politics of education this year.
I got the mic now, I'm not sure it's working. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Dana, but for 10 years before you took my class, I was teaching that class. And for almost 15 years after you took it, I was teaching that class. And one of the really discouraging things was when we got to the contemporary issues. We were talking about the same damn things in 1996 that we were talking about in 2019 in my class and that you're talking about here. We're still arguing over whether phonics is good. I have a wife who teaches in the CLIPS department who teaches an entire course on what cognitive science has to say to education. Not a whole lot of teachers to be in there.
That's too bad.
There are these silos all over the place. You referenced the Providence Johns Hopkins report. Scott McKay of Public Radio did a commentary where he used quotations about uninterested students with high absentee rates, teachers who didn't really care that much about teaching or even showing up, high absentee rates, decaying buildings, out-of-date textbooks, devastating quotations from a report that was made in 1993. So, you're young and optimistic. You seem to see some things happening now that are better than they were a few years ago. I'm looking for optimism. My question is two things. One, what things specifically, if you are optimistic about anything, are you optimistic about? And then to follow up on the question over here, why don't you do a story on Providence and its latest efforts to turn things around as the 3 years per school superintendent carousel continues to spin and we see the same quotes and the same stories over and over? Come back home, Dana.
So a story on Providence is on my story list right now, and I don't know when I'll be able to get to it, but I will for sure write about Providence. I actually got an idea this morning in my meeting with faculty for something specific I might write about. Optimism. I am optimistic that teachers are more respected than they were a few years ago, but because I know education is cyclical, I fully expect that there'll be more backlash against teachers in the future. I'm not a starry-eyed optimist, and I'm really not overall an optimist. I don't think many reporters are. I don't think it's a profession that truly attracts optimistic people. Teachers ought to be optimists, though, and I think great teachers usually are. Yeah, I'm looking at my teacher friend John Gold. I think the one really big point of optimism I have is I think that in the teaching profession there's been a really broad cultural shift around teachers accepting a greater locus of responsibility and there being less blaming of families and parents when kids aren't learning. And I do think that has come through some of the good work of the education reform movement, whatever its excesses have been. And I think it's come from generational change, and I think it's come from the larger social justice conversation. But I think it's more and more unacceptable in schools, especially urban schools, to say, good parents, good students, bad parents, bad students. Those are cliches that, frankly, we've all heard if you've been immersed in education. And I think it's not really acceptable to say those things anymore. That's positive. I think that there's more principals who are getting into classrooms. I think there's some teachers may not like that very much, but if it's a good principal, it's probably a pretty good thing. So I just think there's more focus on getting better. I guess the phrase I'd use is more of a commitment to continuous improvement in the field. And I think people will debate heavily how to get there and the specifics of it. And reading is an example. But I don't think you see as much just sort of placid acceptance of things like achievement gaps by income and race. I think there's much more like, we're getting up in the morning to solve some big problems here. This is very, very important work.
Yes.
I have a question about higher education reporting at the New York Times. It seems to me that when I look at the front page stories about colleges and universities, I see so much devoted to the Ivy League and specifically Ivy League admissions. And that's in like a whole universe where, the Ivy League educates 1,500 first-gen college students a year. Meanwhile, Cal State system is 60,000, HBCU is 40,000. So talking about optimism in universities, there's like huge kind of bright spots there, and I covered the Cal States in LA last year. So I was wondering if there's any sort of conversations about higher education reporting at the New York Times.
So I cover K-12. I occasionally dabble in college admissions reporting because, to be honest, our readers have a very high demand for reporting on college admissions. After the Varsity Blues scandal broke, my editor asked me to take a look at accommodations on the SAT and ACT, and we did an investigation using data that showed pretty definitively that you have much more access to disability accommodations if you're from wealthy zip codes. I mean, the numbers were staggering. In some places, it was 7 or 8 times the national rate of accommodations, and it was very closely correlated with wealth. We talk very often about whether we cover the Ivy Leagues too much. The tough thing right now is that there are a cluster of cases wending their way through the federal court system about elite college admissions. And these could reach the Supreme Court. And you bet we're going to be covering it very heavily, because if affirmative action is overturned at the Supreme Court, it will affect every institution up and down the ladder that is selective in any way. More broadly, could we be doing a better job on HBCUs, community colleges, and non-selective institutions? I agree with you. Yes. We have a single higher education reporter at the New York Times, one individual. The Harvard case presented thousands of pages of documents. Covering a federal court case like that, as it goes, from the lower level to the higher level courts, is extremely complex. So I want to give a lot of credit to my colleague, Anna Hartakalis, who has been covering the admissions scandal. Varsity Blues, an unprecedented federal investigation of graft in college admissions. That's not a story also that you're going to let go. So, we're in a climate at the New York Times where we're struggling successfully toward a successful business model. We don't have an education desk at the New York Times. On the news pages, so the straight news side where I reside, there are 4 education reporters. Me, I cover national K-12, a full-time reporter for the New York City schools, our hometown school system, the biggest in the country, 1 higher education reporter, and 1 Washington Post reporter focused on federal policy in the Trump administration. So that's the landscape.
So can I go ahead?
Please.
So thank you so much for your comments. So there's a lot of social science research that shows that high social class parents in particular are very good at intervening in their kids' schools, often to get them advantages that many other parents are not able to get for their kids, and often that are in some ways sort of stretching the rules or making exceptions to give them unfair advantages. I'm wondering what you would like to say to high social class parents.
Oh man, me personally? Well, I'm a reporter for the New York Times, so I have to be a little bit careful with how I'm going to respond. If we were talking over drinks, I might. Okay, so I have a lot of friends who are in the group that you're talking about, and they do talk to me about the big decisions they make. I think the overall first thing I tell them is just because a school, say 50% of children at a school are reaching state-level reading proficiency, that does not mean that your child has a 50% chance of reaching state-level reading proficiency. So that is the first thing that I tell my friends when they decide if they're going to go to their neighborhood public school in New York City. And for those of us immersed in education, that might be like, well, that's so obvious. It's not obvious to people. And in fact, it's kind of nice that it's not obvious to people. When parents make decisions about where they send their kid to school, they are making an incredibly high-stakes decision in their own mind. They truly believe that test score, many of them truly believe that it is a reflection of the work that's going on in that building, and they may not be thinking about what different kids are bringing into the building with them. So I usually will start the conversation with what I just said, and then secondly, I'll say to them, you do want to be in a school where all kids are moving forward. So as opposed to looking at those raw proficiency rates, can you take a look at growth over time? Are they growing their kids on free and reduced lunch and those kids that aren't on free and reduced lunch? Well, both groups ought to be making good progress. Those are the kinds of things that you might think about if you're looking at data. And then just the other thing I talk to them about is, I'll just say from personal experience that attending diverse integrated schools and busing was a positive influence on my life and had no appreciable negative influence on my life whatsoever, and helped me achieve my goals, didn't hurt me from achieving any of my goals. So I'll talk about that, and those are some of the conversations I have a lot.
Right next to you.
Hi, Dana. Thank you for being here today. My name is also Dana.
Oh, hi.
I wanted to ask, I had the opportunity to work for a nonprofit last summer, also co-founded by a Brown alum that actually focus on professional development methods for teachers in transfer schools specifically. And transfer schools aren't often as talked about as, whether it's the Regents or standardized prep scores, because there's so much pressure on teachers to translate into that. And particularly in transfer schools, when I got to meet all these teachers and actually got to sit in classrooms in transfer schools, the biggest value added of these teachers, was often in pastoral learning or recognizing that their kids who were overaged and didn't graduate a GED, this is like their second or third chance at high school and they don't know they're going to make it to college, was, recognizing that different background and being more often, a pastoral figure or a therapist than a teacher, in addition actually to being a teacher. And I guess there was just so much that they were doing that I think is not being communicated in media particularly. And I'm really interested in whether you think other indicators, because they're not under pressure and they're using school improvement science methods to teach learning differently and to teach teachers differently. I'm wondering whether you think more varied indicators other than standardized test scores and or more interactive media like video, like all those things that could supplement your reporting could show that value that teachers are giving to certain students that has nothing to do with grades.
So, a lot of the smart education economists bat this around. They talk about whether you might look at things like chronic absence or even surveys where students are asked, do you enjoy coming to this classroom? There's a lot of things you could look at in a data-driven way to try to get a better grasp. What's your sense, Matt? Where is the state of that work?
So most of the states have moved towards thinking about diversifying their school level accountability measures, and the primary new addition is measures of chronic absences. Work around reforming teacher performance measures really kind of peaked under the Obama administration and now has kind of receded, although there's been a new landscape that's been made from that. I think that your question really is important, but from what we know from some demonstration trials in places like Kentucky and Vermont that looked at kind of portfolio models of evaluating students' performance and aggregating that up to the teachers, is that while these ideas are probably more holistic and show kind of multidimensional talents and strengths, that they're incredibly costly to do, and even at a high investment of resources, pretty unreliable. Even more so than all of the types of, important questions that have been raised about models like value added, teachers' contributions to student performance. It's just this subjectivity around evaluating something that is kind of rubric based is incredibly hard to do.
I think you also have to grapple with what if some things can't be measured. And I a few years ago, there was more of like a gung-ho attitude that we can measure what matters, we just got to get there. And I think now people are feeling a little more realistic about that. And we need to communicate what matters in other ways with the public about teaching. What you're saying is absolutely so important. Like, so many teachers are doing social work. Yeah. And I do hope that we can illuminate those stories. Certainly as a reporter, I remember when I was covering the West Virginia teacher strike, this guy was telling me, well, a lot of my students, I have a couple students with ADHD, but they don't take their medicine because their parents are selling it for their own drug opioid addictions. And then also, we just spent a long time creating a Christmas program, gift thing for the students at my school, because otherwise a bunch of them are not going to get Christmas presents. So this is in West Virginia, rural white poverty. I mean, when you look at those teachers out on strike because they're making $36,000, $37,000 per year, and then say, what did you do yesterday? Those are some of the stories that I tried to get into those articles, because it's not what you think sometimes.
So I'm really interested to hear you talk a little bit more about your positionality as an interviewer, and especially for stories that are usually on a shorter timeline, and what does that look like to go into communities that you may not necessarily be welcome, and not just in terms of like ideology, as you mentioned before, but I'm especially thinking along race lines and class lines, and to kind of add on to that, do you think it's your job as a reporter to hear and honor the narratives, or to push back against what you're hearing from different individuals?
It's definitely my job to hear what people are saying to me, but I do have to ask tough questions of every kind of person. There's no kind of person that I wouldn't ask a tough question to. I'm very conscious of whether the person I'm speaking to has experience dealing with the media. So, for example, like a low-income single mom who's talking to me about her struggle to get her kid into a good school in San Francisco. I call her back over and over again to tell her this is what's going to be in the article. Do you want this to be in the article? You mentioned to me that your ex has not been helping with the process of researching schools. That doesn't have to be in the article if you don't want it to be. So she's not equipped to come into a conversation with me by saying on the record, off the record, on background, all these terms that I need to explain to like Brown professors because they're freighted with a ton of, they're jargony, you know? So for someone who I know is not experienced dealing with the media, I take a lot of effort to make sure that they're aware what will be in the article in advance. And I also explain to them some of what may happen when the piece comes out. You know, someone may approach you on social media or want to talk about it, stuff like that. And people are smart. They get it, you know? But I do try to guide them through it a little bit, guide them through the process. Now, if I'm dealing with a public relations official for a major school district, an elected representative, somebody running for public office, I mean, I don't do any of that. It's their job to know how to deal with someone like me, and if they don't know how to deal with someone like me, they haven't done their prep. In terms of coming into communities as an upper class white woman, I give it an enormous amount of thought, lose sleep over it, stress about it. All I can say is I try to do the legwork before I get there, even on a tight deadline. I spoke about this earlier when I was having coffee with some students and postdocs. If I'm going to a community to write about some kind of controversial issue that's happening there, I try to have at least one phone call beforehand with someone who's in the middle of it and who's really different from me in whatever way. And just hear out, look, we've been discussing this for a year. You're coming tomorrow. Let them just vent, spout. It can be off the record on background, like a private conversation, or it can be on the record. You know, if you start asking around, you can usually find like, oh, that's the mom that's really active on this. Call that mom. And usually that mom is pretty excited to get the call and wants to make sure that your coverage is going to be accurate. So I just try to approach it with humility and say, I want to get the story right. You know, thank you for giving me your time. I want to see if you can kind of debrief me a little bit. So once I'm armed with that conversation, then I go to the place and I hope that I'll be less of an idiot. You know, I just hope that my questions will be smarter and I won't come off as completely uneducated on whatever it is that they're debating. But I think you have to be conscious of who you are, your own background, your own biases, but you cannot let it hobble you, prevent you from doing the important work that's incredibly important. Because you can't change who you are, what you bring to the table. You can just sort of educate yourself. You know, don't go around asking people stuff that's Googleable. That's an easy one. You can do your homework by reading a lot as well, in addition to talking to people.
Great. We have time for one more question.
I want to thank you very much for speaking. I came in here with a judgment that it wasn't going to be very good.
Oh.
All right? To be very honest with you, I don't read the New York Times. I don't really care about it. I am from an elite college a long time ago where they had a teacher preparation course. And this was during the Vietnam War, and everybody that was dodging the war became teachers. I eventually became a teacher in the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts. I taught incarcerated young men and women. And we were supposed to teach them critical thinking. It just doesn't work. But my question to you is, because you raised it, and someone over on the other side about money. You said in Brooklyn some $2 million a year is raised for schools and things like that. I remember a cartoon of a school bake sale with a person's comment saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if the Air Force had to have a bake sale to raise money for the B-1 bomber? And yes. I remember that. Yeah. So you haven't touched on that. No one has touched the Pentagon or this war nation, what we do, where our real priorities are. Because I'll tell you, I am substitute teaching now in a school district in Rhode Island, and no one really cares. The money's not there. The biggest fight every year is the school budget. Not enough money. But the Pentagon can get all the money it wants, and the politicians don't care. So what's the remedy? Thank you.
Wow, you said a lot there, which expresses your opinion. Yes, I think in an ideal world we'd have more money to spend on education. Other countries do not necessarily spend more than we do, but they spend more on other things. They spend more on programs to help families in poverty with things like universal childcare, so that kids are started off in life in an environment with well-trained professionals that help get them ready for school. I have visited the Scandinavian countries that have drop-off on a sliding scale for income, where you can drop your kids off, any time of day, working parent or just a stay-at-home mom that needs a break. There's a place for you to bring your child. So that's just very different. They do more to help people who are making a low wage by supplementing their income. Much more generous welfare states. People don't go into debt to go into college in other countries. That's where they're spending more. It's not necessarily that they're spending more on the K-12 per pupil funding. So when I think about what we ask schools to do relative to the dollar, that's where I am staggered, because we haven't done all the other things that children need to thrive.
Please join me in thanking Dana.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.